Welcome back to Unapologetic Finally, a space for honest conversations about faith, healing, identity, and the things many of us have carried quietly for far too long. The conversations that don't always make it into words, the questions that sit in the back of your mind, the ones we wrestle with internally long after everything else gets quiet, the moments that shape how you move, even when no one else knows they happen. I'm Dr. Bertina Els, and if you've been on this journey with me, then you already know. This isn't just a podcast, something you listen to. It's something you feel. Because this space is built on truth, not the kind that's easy to say, but the kind that asks you to be honest with yourself. The kind that doesn't let you stay where you've been. Once you've seen something differently, that's not what this is. Because real growth doesn't happen in avoidance. It happens in acknowledgement. In episode 1, we took a closer look at what it means to be the one people depend on. Not just what you do, but what you carry. The expectations, the responsibility, the emotional weight that often goes unseen. And for many of us, that role didn't develop overnight. It was shaped over time in moments where we learned how to adapt, how to respond, how to become what was needed. Even we were still figuring things out ourselves. And in learning how to be dependable, we also became familiar with handling things on our own. In episode 2, we began to recognize something different. Not just what we were carrying, but how it was affecting us. We talked about the shift that happens when you start paying attention to what no longer feels right. When your awareness becomes more specific, more honest. You begin to notice where your energy is going, where your presence is being stretched, where something no longer aligns, even if it wants to. And once you reach that point, there's no going back to not seeing it. But here's where the journey continues. Because recognizing something and even setting boundaries around it is not the final step. It's what comes after that requires something deeper. Because once you've identified what's heavy, once you've acknowledged what needs to change, you're faced with a decision. Not just about what to adjust, but about what to release And that is where many people pause. Because releasing something requires trust. Trust that you don't have to hold it all together. Trust that you don't have to manage everything on your own. And if you've spent a long time, like I have, being the one who handles things, that kind of trust doesn't come naturally. So today, we're going further, not just into awareness, not just into boundaries, but into something that changes how you live. What happens when what used to sustain you no longer feels sustainable? What happens when effort alone doesn't resolve what you're experiencing? What happens when maintaining everything begins to cost you more than it should? And what happens when you finally reach the point where you can no longer continue in that same way? Not because you lack strength, but because you recognize your limits. Because you're no longer willing to function in a way that leaves you depleted. Today, we're talking about surrender. Not stepping back out of defeat, not withdrawing out of frustration, but releasing with intention. Letting go of what was never yours to manage alone. Letting go of the pressure to maintain everything. Letting go of expectations that were never clearly yours to carry, and learning what it means to trust God with what you've been trying to hold together yourself. Because what brought you here was never meant to take you all the way. So wherever you are right now, whether you're moving through your day, sitting in stillness, or taking a moment just for yourself, I want you to stay present in this conversation, not with pressure, but with openness. Because what you hear may not just resonate with you, it may help you move. Let's begin. I want to talk about when what used to work no longer fits. There comes a point where what once carried you no longer supports you in the same way. Not because anything around you has drastically changed, but because something within you has become more aware. You're still functioning. You're still showing up. Still doing what needs to be done. And from the outside, everything appears consistent. But your experience of it is no longer the same. What used to feel manageable now feels heavy. What used to feel routine now feels draining. What you once moved through quickly now lingers with you longer than it used to. And it's not always easy to explain because nothing looks obviously wrong. There's no clear disruption, no visible breakdown, but internally, you're more aware of what something cost you. And that awareness changes how you experience everything. Because when you begin to notice that shift, you also begin to notice something else. What you've been tolerating, the things you've adjusted to, the ways you've stretched yourself, the moments you dismissed so that everyone else could continue. And you start to recognize that you've been carrying more than just responsibility. You've been carrying expectations, unspoken ones, assumed ones, and sometimes self-imposed ones. And when you've lived that way for a long time, it becomes familiar. It becomes normal. So when something inside of you begins to question it, it doesn't always feel like clarity at first. Wow. Sometimes it feels like discomfort. But that discomfort is not something to ignore. It's something to understand. Because what you're feeling is the difference between what you've been managing and what is actually sustainable for you. And those are not always the same. I want you to think about this. Where in your life have you been functioning but not feeling at peace? Where have you been continuing, not because it aligns, but because it's familiar? Because here's what often happens. When something no longer fits, we don't immediately change it. We try to adjust ourselves instead. We give more time. We extend more patience. We make more room. We tell ourselves, maybe it will get better. And sometimes that adjustment becomes a pattern of staying longer than we should, a pattern of holding more than we need to. And over time, that pattern becomes exhausting. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Because you're continuing something that your awareness is already questioning. Ecclesiastes 3:6 says this: there's a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to hold on and a time to release. And discernment is knowing the difference. Because not everything you've carried is meant to be carried indefinitely. And just because you've been able to handle it doesn't mean you're meant to continue in it. Just because you've made it work before doesn't mean it still works for you now. Just because something has history doesn't mean it still has alignment. Wow. I want you to sit with this honesty. What feels heavier now that didn't feel that way before? What are you continuing to carry simply because you've always carried it? And what would it look like to acknowledge that it may no longer fit? Because that moment, when something no longer feels the same, is not random. It's an invitation. An invitation to pay attention, an invitation to respond differently. And sometimes that awareness shows up in a very specific way, not publicly, not in a way everyone else can see, but in a moment that makes you stop and realize, I can't ignore this. And that's exactly what happened for me. It was the moment I couldn't ignore. I want to take you into a moment, not one that anyone else would have seen, not something that happened in a room, but something that came to me privately. I remember receiving a message, not part of an ongoing conversation, not something I had invited, not something I had opened the door to. It was unexpected, unprompted, and completely out of alignment with what that space was supposed to represent. And as I read it, the message, I didn't need time to interpret it. I didn't need clarification. I knew this is inappropriate. And what made it more difficult was who it came from. This wasn't just anyone. This was someone in a position of authority, someone connected to a place that I had trusted, a place I had come to for healing. And I remember sitting there, looking at that message, feeling a level of discomfort that I had experienced before, because this wasn't the first time. It wasn't the first time something inappropriate had been directed toward me. Not the same person, but the same level of authority. Not the first time that something inappropriate was said, and I had to process it on my own. And in that moment, I wasn't just reacting to what was in front of me. I was recognizing a pattern. And that changes how you process things, because now it's not just about what happened, it's about what it represents. And I remember asking myself, what do I do with this? Do I respond? Do I ignore it? Do I address it directly? Or do I handle it quietly, the way I've done before? And this time, I didn't just sit with it. I responded. But I responded in a way that reflected who I am. I made it clear that I respected their position. I made it clear that I valued the space. But I also made it clear that what was sent was not appropriate. And eventually, there was an apology. It was acknowledged. It was addressed. But even in that moment, a part of me still chose what I had learned. I held it. I processed it internally. I acknowledged it. And even though I didn't create a response that extended the moment, something in me understood that the damage had already been done. Because an apology doesn't always remove the impact. It doesn't erase the moment. It doesn't restore what was disrupted. And what I began to realize was this: forgiveness and continued access are not the same thing. Forgiveness and continued access are not the same thing. I could accept the apology. I could move forward without bitterness. But that didn't mean I needed to remain in the same environment. But for a while, I stayed. I continued showing up. I continued moving forward as if everything was normal. Because that's what I had learned to do, to adjust, to keep going, to carry it quietly. But over time, I began to understand something more clearly. Healing doesn't happen in places where your awareness is asking you to move differently. And even when something is addressed, even when an apology is given, you still have to ask yourself, what is healthiest for me now? And my answer wasn't to stay. Not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. I realized that staying in that space would require me to keep overriding what I had already recognized. And I just wasn't willing to do that anymore. So I made a choice. I walked away. Not loudly, not with conflict, but with understanding. Because I had reached a place where I knew that honoring myself meant no longer remaining in what I had already identified as harmful. Listen, truth. You can accept an apology and still choose distance. You can forgive someone and still decide not to stay connected. You can honor the moment without returning to the environment that created it. And walking away is not a lack of grace. It's an act of wisdom. Because this part is where many people struggle. We've been taught that if someone apologizes, we're supposed to stay. We've been taught that forgiveness means restoring everything. But healing requires discernment. And sometimes the most honest decision you can make is to move on, to move forward without looking back. Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Guarding your heart doesn't mean you stop loving people. It means you stop allowing what harmed you to continue having access to you. And that moment taught me something I carry with me now. Not every situation needs to be fixed. Not every relationship needs to be maintained, and not every place is meant for you to stay. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is recognize what happened, honor what you felt, and choose a different path forward. That's the most powerful thing you can do. There comes a point where strength is no longer the answer. Not because strength isn't valuable, not because strength didn't carry you, but because strength was never meant to carry everything. And for many of us, we don't realize that right away, because strength has been our default. It's been our response to pressure, our response to pain, our response to responsibility. When things got difficult, we became stronger. When things got overwhelming, we adjusted. When things didn't feel right, we kept going. But what happens when strength is no longer enough? What happens when you've done everything you know how to do and something still doesn't sit right? That's where surrender begins. And I want to be clear about something. Surrender is not giving up. It's not weakness. It's not failure. Surrender is recognition. It's the moment where you acknowledge, I can't keep carrying this the same way. The strength says, I'll hold it together. Surrender says, I don't have to hold everything. Strength says, I'll figure it out. The surrender says, I trust God with what I can't control. Strength says, I'll keep going no matter what. Surrender says, I need to move differently. And this is where it gets real, because surrender requires you to release control. Surrender is hard. And if you've been the strong one for a long time, control feels like safety. Control feels like stability. Control feels like responsibility. So letting go doesn't feel natural. It feels uncomfortable. It feels uncertain. It can even feel like you're doing something wrong, because you've built your identity around being the one who handles everything. So when you start to release things, you begin to ask yourself, who am I if I'm not carrying all of this? Whew. God, that tracks. I want you to sit with this. What are you still holding? Simply because you're used to being strong? What have you convinced yourself you have to carry, even though it's exhausting you? And if you're honest, what would it look like to release it? Matthew 11:28 says, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. No more strength, no, not more strength, not more responsibility, rest. And for many strong people, rest feels unfamiliar, because we've learned how to function in pressure, but not always how to receive rest. But God is not asking you to prove how much you can carry. He's inviting you to release it. And listen, you don't have to carry everything to be strong. You don't have to stay in everything to be faithful. You don't have to fix everything to be valuable, and you don't have to hold everything together to be whole. Because what I've come to understand is this: strength got me here, but surrender is what keeps me here. It is what allows me to move forward. Surrender is what creates space for healing, space for clarity, space for peace. And most importantly, space for me. I want you to reflect on this honesty. Where in your life is God asking you to release something that you've been trying to manage on your own? Where are you holding on out of habit, not purpose? And what would it look like to trust God with it instead? And this too is where it becomes real, not just in thought, but in decision. Because recognizing something is one thing, but choosing differently is something else It's something else entirely. And this is the space where many people hesitate, not because they don't know what needs to change, but because of how it feels to actually change it. Because letting go comes with emotion, not just relief, but weight, guilt. Comes with fear, uncertainty. And those feelings don't always show up loudly. Sometimes they show up in questions, quiet ones, persistent ones. What will people think? Am I doing the right thing? Am I being too extreme? Am I walking away too soon? And underneath all those questions is something deeper. The fear of being misunderstood. The fear of disappointing people. The fear of stepping outside of who others expect you to be. Because when you've been the one who shows up, the one who stays, the one who carries people, become used to that version of you. They become comfortable with it. So when you start choosing differently, it doesn't just feel new to you. It feels unfamiliar to them. And sometimes their discomfort can make you question your decision. Because part of you knows that is necessary. Part of you knows that is necessary, but another part of you is still processing the shift. You're learning how to move without overextending. You're learning how to respond without overcommitting. You're learning how to step back without feeling like you're abandoning something. And that takes time. That takes intention. Because letting go, it's not just about releasing something externally. It's about recalibrating internally. Yeah. So let's reframe this. Letting go of what drains you is not selfish. It is not selfish. It's necessary. Letting go of environments that don't align is not failure, it's growth. Letting go of roles that are costing you your peace, no matter what those roles are, is not weakness, it's wisdom. And I want to add something to that. Letting go is not losing something. It's making room for clarity, making room for peace, making room for a version of you that no longer has to function in survival mode. Now think about this. What are you holding on to because you feel obligated to? What are you continuing because you're worried about how it will look if you stop? And if you remove the pressure of expectations, what decision would you make? Second Timothy 1:7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind." A sound mind means clarity. It means discernment. It means the ability to make decisions that align with truth, not fear. And sometimes guilt feels like responsibility, but they are not the same. You are not responsible for maintaining what is costing you your peace. You are not required to remain in spaces that don't honor you. You are allowed to choose differently. Even if it takes people time to understand. Because what's really happening here is not just a decision, it's a shift in identity. You're no longer operating from, what do I need to do to keep everything together? You're operating from, what is aligned for me now? Ooh, and that changes everything. Because now your decisions are not driven by pressure. They're guided by clarity. And as you begin to let go, you may still feel uncomfortable, moments of hesitation, moments where you question yourself, moments where you revisit the decision, but that doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you're adjusting to a new way of being, because the version of you that carried everything is no longer the version of you that has to. And that is where freedom begins. Listen, before we end, I want you to take a breath. Not to move on quickly, but to actually feel what this moment represents. Because something has shifted, not just in what you've heard, but in what you're now able to recognize. If you've been the one who carried more than you ever talked about, the one who made things work, the one who kept showing up even when it cost you, then this isn't just another conversation. This is an invitation. An invitation to stop negotiating with what you already know. An invitation to stop overriding what you've already felt. An invitation to stop managing everything and start honoring yourself. Because the truth is, you don't need more pressure. You don't need more responsibility. You don't need to prove anything by continuing to carry what's been wearing you down. What you need is permission. Permission to step out of what no longer aligns. Permission to move without explaining every decision. Permission to choose a path that reflects who you are now, not who you had to be before. And that kind of permission doesn't come from people. It comes from within. It comes from a place where you finally say, I understand what this is. And I'm no longer going to ignore it. Because you can't heal in the same patterns that required you to silence yourself. And you can't move forward without constantly returning to what you've already outgrown. So as you leave this moment, I want you to focus on what you're losing. I don't want you to focus on what you're losing. I want you to focus on what you're gaining. Clarity, peace, alignment. And most importantly, yourself. Not the version of you that had to carry everything, but the version of you that now understands you don't have to. And as you continue forward, there may still be moments where you pause, moments where you question, moments where you feel the pull of what's familiar. But don't confuse familiarity with what's right for you. Growth will ask you to move differently, and that's not something to fear. That's something to honor. That's something to honor. If this moment met you where you are, don't keep it to yourself. Send it to someone who's been carrying more than they say. Let it reach the person who needs to hear that they are allowed to choose differently. And if you haven't already, stay connected to Unapologetic Finally. There's more ahead, more truth, more clarity, more growth. This is not the end of your journey. It's the moment you start walking in a new direction. And as you do, move with awareness, move with intention, and most of all, move with courage. If this series has spoken to you, I invite you to reflect on it, because healing, faith, and purpose are not destinations, they are journeys. And you don't have to walk that journey alone. So until next time, keep growing, keep seeking, and keep living your truth with courage.